Hello, Chip.
Well, hi there. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. The sun is out. It's a beautiful day, and
It is.
I'm calling because I wanted to talk to you about the history of the future.
Okay.
One of the stories my mom has told over and over from her past is a story about a future. Well, it's also a story about skipping classes and dodging truant officers. See, when my mom was a senior in high school, as her story goes, on multiple occasions after attendance was called, she would find a reason to leave her classroom in East Providence and then take a bus and a train to Flushing Meadows for the 1964 World's Fair. This trek was more than a rebellious crossing of state lines. It was a journey into the future. Not the future in some vague, abstract way. The future had a shape. It had machines, cities, and promises. It was something you could walk through, ride, stand inside of, a different future from the one found in the home economics classroom of Riverside High School. This is the time of year we tend to look forward. New year, new plans, new future. But eventually today's future will be the past that our children tell their children about. Back to the Future 2, Blade Runner, A Space Odyssey, all futuristic movies that are now set in the past. Sci-fi futures that not so long ago felt impossibly far away. Some of these futures look familiar. In the case of the World's Fair, many of the past's futures have become landmarks, and some of them never showed up at all. But that's not really the point. Imagining the future isn't about getting it right. It's about opening up space to think beyond what's possible right now. Sometimes those imagined futures stay imaginary, and sometimes they become real things. Not exactly as planned, but real enough to shape the world we live in. Later in the episode, I talked to Feliks Banel, a Seattle-based historian, about how imagining the future in post-war Seattle for the 1962 World's Fair helped shape the Seattle of today. But before we talk about the future of the past, I thought we'd start the year thinking about the future of today, not as a prediction, but as a practice. To help with that, I called my friend JT Mudge, a professional futurist and strategist who is an adjunct professor at the University of Houston teaching foresight and change theory and does strategic foresight work with the United Nations Development Program. The opinions and views expressed in his conversation with me are those of JT's and do not necessarily represent either the University of Houston or the United Nations Development Program. Here's my conversation with JT Mudge. JT, thank you so much for being here. You spent a week in Seoul, Korea, workshopping some possible futures for cities, global cities, with some leaders of cities all over the world. So I'm excited to hear about that. But before we get into that, this work of futurism and futures and foresight, how did you discover this? How did you get to it? What was the draw for you?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, foresight itself is in futures studies is a broad thing, right? So we don't just look far out; we have to look really far wide, because the further we look out, the more things that are happening, maybe that you wouldn't normally be concerned about, will have an impact on you, right? So you might not really be concerned about what's happening in a certain industry or in a certain type of government or whatever, but over time, that could definitely have an impact. So we have to think really wide, and it helps to have not necessarily subject matter expertise, but at least understandings of the different types of areas of change. So, like social change, technological change, political change, economic change, all those things. And so, for me, I've always been interested in that. So, I think, like a lot of futurists, we're sort of like polymaths. We study a lot of different things. We are interested in a lot of different things. We very rarely get bored of things. For me, I gravitated early on in my career to be a consultant because I like going into new experiences, taking stuff I learned from other industries, and sort of mashing it all together. And I have high expertise in technology, but most of the time I was also implementing things about change management, or how, the finance end of things, or the social aspect of things. Working with cities, and so I think for me, I was always practicing foresight in a lot of ways because I was always stretching people and asking the what if, and trying to just really get at the core of where they're trying to go. That was a lot of what my consulting was around. And then, during, right before the pandemic, really, about a year before I went to Barcelona for the Smart City Expo World Congress. I was doing some stuff with cities and mobility at the time. I kind of stumbled across people that were, doing sort of future scenarios and sort of postcards from the future, and the futures of cities and stuff like that was really a hot topic. I thought that was really interesting. And then as the employment world got disrupted by COVID, I was thinking seriously about what to do next, where I wanted, and I saw a job posting from actually this Institute for the Future, and they wanted somebody with a master's in foresight. And I was like, wait a minute, that's an actual degree I could get. I mean, I kind of knew what it was, but I was like, wait, that I didn't think that was an. I just thought like this is the role someone took on or something. I didn't know it was actually you get like a formal degree in it. Then when I found futures, I was like, no, I want to spend the time on this, and partly because the people I met in that process, right, early on, I was like, wait a minute, these people are the outliers in their organizations. They're the ones that think differently. They're the ones that people don't really know what to do with a lot of times, which was my experience as a professional. So I was like, wait, I finally found people that that thought and worked like me, and that was as big a draw as anything else. And that's just been one of the best things that's ever happened to me, to be honest.
So you talked about thinking wide, and it sounds like your experience, you're much more of a generalist than a specialist, and that's part of the draw is you're looking at technology, but also political, economic. Is that what you mean when you talk about looking more widely to look further?
It's not so much being a generalist. I think there's nothing wrong with that term, really. But I think that that's not quite what it is. It's definitely there at levels of expertise. It's almost like we have to have multiple specialties, right? I mean, the amount of studying we have to do across all those categories is quite extensive and stuff to keep up on. Now, we're not going to be experts in all those, but we're definitely not just an armchair generalist and say economics or things like that. I have to look at what reinsurance is. I don't have an economics background, but I have to understand like how insurance companies get paid and how that gets impacted when we could have massive flooding and things like that, and who's paying for that, and how are they subsidized, and what happens to central banks. And I got to learn all this stuff, at least to some degree, to be able to see signals of change in those areas to see how they might be impacting other areas.
Tell me more about what is this industry really? What are the misconceptions? What really do you do as a futurist, as somebody who works in foresight? How do you explain it?
Yeah, there's a couple of quick ways to explain it, and then maybe one that's just a tiny bit longer. And so the real quick answer is we study change. As soon as says, what does a futurist do? We say we study change. Similarly to a historian who might study change as well, but we actually then see, well, not just what has happened, but why did it happen? How did it happen? And how will that impact potentially things happening in the future based upon what we see happening now? So it's really about just understanding change and learning to anticipate a little bit better. We don't try to predict, or at least most futurists don't, especially people that practice strategic foresight. It's not about predicting. It's not even really about putting probabilistic statistics together, right? It's really about not being surprised. So, hey, if you thought through things to know that, this could happen or this could happen. And then once you kind of get to that aspect, then you can kind of say, well, what does that mean to me, right? Why do I care? What am I going to do about it? The first part is really just about understanding change. And so that's what we do. We have a methodology behind it. And there's all different types of futurists, but strategic foresight is kind of like a special subset of that. But all of us are futurists. That's the thing. As like humans, that's one of the things that define us, really, is we have this ability to not just plan for the future like some animals can, right? Like some animals use tools and have granaries and prepare for the winter and all that stuff. Well, we have this ability to create visions of things that don't exist and maybe never will exist, right? This ability to fantasize and then also through that project. That's unlike pretty much anything else on this planet that we know of. And so we all have the ability to do it, but we do it really poorly in a way because we weren't meant to. We were meant to think linearly. We weren't really meant to think in this exponential way in which change actually happens. And so we get stuck a lot of times, and that's where the methodology of foresight, specifically at an organization level, really comes in handy because it says, hey, we're not going to take the base assumptions that we're so good at putting together. We're actually going to have to look at all these different curves of change and how change happens differently, and like we said, talk about the wideness of the change, and then that's a little more complex. And having the methodology and tools really helps with that. So that's the practice. The professional practice is knowing there's all different methodologies around it, but having some tools in your toolkit, knowing how to do that, and then helping people walk through that, because we're not necessarily experts in an organization. We're going to rely on other experts for the content, but we're gonna help push them forward, give them the ways of thinking differently about the future, so that they aren't surprised and they have some stuff to build upon and maybe even build a vision.
I want to get into that in terms of what some tools are. And you talked about mapping and influencing as different stages of strategic foresight. I've been involved with a number of strategic plans, which are generally very aspirational, very goal based. This is what we would like. How does foresight work inform processes like that? Or what tools from foresight could be used to better inform strategic planning?
Yeah, that's one of the best uses for strategic foresight, strategic planning. That's what I do at United Nations Development Program. Or one of the things that we do. My team is the strategic plan for the organization. I'm part of the strategy and futures team. So the futurists on the team really sort of help that process along. So in foresight, what we call that first stage is mapping the future. And like you said, you might have a vision, like this is where we want to go. That first step doesn't really care where you want to go. Right? It's not about where you want to go, really, because there isn't a sense you need to define the scope of where you want to look at, right? So you do care about that. But after you've kind of nailed that down, you don't really, when you're looking for change, you're not really saying, well, what change do we want? And that's a really hard thing for people to do at that stage, because they want the solution. They want to bring their hopes and dreams and visions in there. So we try really hard to distance that as much as possible until the second phase, which is influencing, where we take all this change and we look at what are the implications for you, for your organization, right? And then, okay, what do you want to do about it? What could you do about it, first of all? Because there might be brand new things. There almost always are brand new things that come out of that process. Like, oh, I didn't know this was a direction that might happen. Maybe we can influence that, or maybe we should avoid that.
You've talked about futures being plural with an S. And so, again, you already said you're not predicting, you're not in the business of telling people what's going to happen, but more, here are a number of possibilities. I guess, how do you prioritize, or how do you understand what's important when you get to that phase?
I mean, I think that's exactly it. Is the importance, value, the priority is completely based upon the context, right? So we could do like a future of mobility in cities, for example, right? And for one city, what's important to pay attention to might be different from another city. Some cities may already have some of the things that are in place, like maybe automated buses, right? We see that in some places now, automated transport. So maybe some cities already have that, and other ones don't, or maybe some cities don't want that, or whatever the case may be. So the context is super important, and we don't, as futurists, prioritize what's important for the organization, but we help them see what some of those examples could be and help them work through it. So it's a very collaborative process. And then we have some tools within that process to help them really understand where those priorities are. So we have ways of looking at different types of futures and then saying, okay, if these things play out, are you prepared for them? Are you not prepared for them? Right? Where are areas that you think you might want to? Then we really start talking about their preferred future. So how do these align with that? What changes do we see that are potential that would accelerate to your preferred future and things like that? So you start to categorize this. Sometimes you start to get groupings of them, like across all these different scenarios, we see this one type of thing happening no matter what, right? I mean, I think for a lot of cities and stuff, like decreased funding, I think most cities are going to be like, okay, we're probably going to have less money. Now, that might not, right? And you should work on some scenarios that have more money, because that's how we get out of these cycles of just assuming and accepting change the way it's already playing out. Sometimes we have to be very creative in that thought, but there's some path. There's always some path to something else. It may be hard. It may be improbable at times, but they have to decide at that point, do they want to try to take the path that seems the most easy to go along with, maybe, or an influence, or they want to do something a little more bold. And then sometimes we go back, right? We go back, okay, well, let's explore this a little bit more now. And so there's a little bit of back and forth. But it's really then about saying what's important to your organization. What are you able to do? What are you prepared to do? What's within your culture to do? What are you already doing? All these questions come into it. And so it's like a lot of other consulting processes. But the thing is, we keep going back to this mapping data that we did. and using that as our sort of evidence and our support and ways of prompting these things. And what would come out of that at the end is a list of strategic questions. So before we even get to really prioritizing, we kind of know like buckets and where things are important, but we say, okay, what are some strategic questions that you now have? And you might say like, should we invest in auto buses? Okay, that's a strategic question. So you come up with a list of these that they think are important based upon these possible futures. And then you say, okay, well, let's put together some options to those questions. But the important thing is that when you're doing this work as a futurist, you're not trying to replace existing systems. You're trying to augment them as existing planning and strategy systems. So if you already have a process for doing strategic planning, it's not about replacing it with this. It's about how can foresight help inform that. And so for each organization, that process also may be different.
It's another data set that you're introducing into an existing structure.
Yeah, but it's a little bit more than that. But it is. That is exactly what it is at some level. But there's like 2 or 3 additional things. One, it's also a way of testing your strategic plans, for example, like wind tunneling, things like that. It's also a way of finding pathways there by doing things called backcasting. And it's also probably the most important thing. It's an inclusive process that brings in stakeholders to provide a more complete picture and less biased picture, as well as ownership of it. So I could give you, Chip, a set of scenarios for your city, right? Here's the things that could possibly happen to mobility, for example. And it's like, great. I read them, I think about them. They're a little bit provocative. I may change some stuff, right? But if I go through that whole process with you and you're finding signals of change and you're saying, hey, I can see how this driver works as we're coming up with discovering what those drivers of change are. And then you're adding inputs into the storyline and the timelines. And you're saying, what about this sanitation worker on the city? What if we put him in a persona? And so you're taking ownership and all the stakeholders are collaborating, taking ownership of this. And it becomes more real to you. It's almost like these people in the scenarios because you've created them, that they are you in a way, right? So that process is not usually included, things like that, in strategic planning. The sense of complete ownership is more about territorialism a lot of times, rather than a shared vision that was built together through data gathering and things like that. So the process is almost more important, I would say, in most cases, than the actual like scenario deliverables. They're just there as examples. Like, hey, I got this thing I can show you.
So you talked about inclusivity in this, and it is a process that does bring stakeholders to the table and in this visioning and this understanding. A lot of the futures of our cities are being planned for people who do not exist, certainly in that city or even on this planet yet. Talk to me about that inclusivity. How do you make sure the right people are at the table?
It just depends on the group you're working with. If they're already doing inclusivity, like if a city's already doing a lot of that and you're working directly with the city planning department or whatever, it's not going to be as hard because they're already really sensitive to that and they have mechanisms for reaching out to community members. But it's really hard, like you said, when those community members aren't there yet. But at least there's a sense of like, we need to reach out, right? You do need to have that first. That's the reason I bring it up is you have to have that spirit of reaching out, and then you need to expand it. And it really is that spirit of reaching out is really this sense of empathy, right? About caring about the people. And so once you do that, you kind of say, okay, well, who else needs to be included? Because you already have that empathetic sort of way forward. So sometimes it's just encouraging that empathy and then really thinking about who needs to be included and what does who mean? Is it like we have minorities and things like that, or is it like people that have different mindsets? Is it like you said that aren't born yet or not in the city? How do we include them if they don't exist? So we have to really be more stewards of possible futures than what I call colonizing futures. So like you imagine that the colonial days, you go in, you kind of take over a land. We as planners and strategists and futurists have the ability of taking over a future in a sense, right? We do try to plan for the future. We want to have agency over the future, but especially when we're thinking about a shared future, like a community, we need to be thinking about what does that mean. If are we prescribing it for them, or because they need to be able to create it too, right? We can't just it's not a thing we just hand over to them and say, okay, it's all ready and it's perfect for you. It's like they need to make it messy. They need to break things in it, right? And fix things in it, right? So they need to have some ownership of it as early as possible. And if you think about future generations, you really need to be thinking about how do we foster future generations in general, right? If you go like a lot of indigenous peoples have ways of doing that. The seventh generation principle from the Haudenosaunee tribe, which is a lot of where a lot of American politics even comes from in our Constitution, it was this way of thinking about we don't make a decision that doesn't include people living 7 generations out, right? A big decision because it's going to impact them. So once you start to think in those terms in general, you start to find empathy, right? You're attaching value to that 7th generation out, or these other people that aren't in your city yet, migrants or whatever it might be, and you try to find ways of inclusion. Sometimes it is just scenarios, right? Based on data, you put make believe people in these scenarios, and then you start to say how are they best represented as a stakeholder? How would that person survive in this city that we're planning?
I want to go to Seoul, Korea. Going back to Metropolis, you spent some time there, kind of looking at the global cities, kind of the major city. Tell me a little more about Metropolis, who they are, and what they do, and what the goal of this conference was that you participated in.
We are partnering with them from the United Nations Development Program. We got in contact with them about some foresight work they wanted to do for cities, right? The cities of tomorrow, planning for cities and things like that. And a number of cities, of course, recognizing some value in that and wanting to increase their foresight maturity at the city level. One of the things we do in development as part of UNDP is we also work with local communities, right? There's even like a local 2030 around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Because we know that change happens on all different levels in municipalities and nations and regions and everything. So we do work with some cities, and one of our things is our team is doing is we're working a little closer with some cities. So this is a good synergy for us to say how can we talk about the change that cities are going through and help enable them, specifically in developing cities, right? So the cities that sort of fit in with the UNDP's goals of increasing development around the world. That was sort of the challenge. And what was really interesting is we talked about that sort of mapping the future and influencing the future. And we could just go in and give them a 2-day workshop on doing foresight and here's how you implement it and here's these tools and whatever. An environment like that, when you're working with people that come to a conference, maybe they're there for some other stuff too, and you have people from all different places, all different languages, doing workshops like that aren't as practical because it's out of context for them, right? So they have to learn how to take it back to their world and say, we did this sort of general stuff. How does that apply?
So who was at the conference in terms of like who's represented? I know it was cities, but what does that mean?
So Metropolis works with city governments that consult with them around advising for policy and things like that. Essentially, the cities that are part of it, since it's Metropolis, right? It's the largest cities around the world, as well as like maybe capital cities for that may be a little bit smaller. And so you have these really large cities like Johannesburg, like Rio de Janeiro. You have places like Singapore representing. You got a bunch of places from around the world. Some from North America, including like Los Angeles and Toronto and New York. So they come, and then different people from the city will be there. Sometimes there'll be mayors. For the portion that we were doing on Foresight, it was mostly people that were like maybe involved in city planning of some level. They're there to kind of figure out how do they do this thing called foresight a little bit better. And I think what we see from everybody, doesn't matter if you're a city or you're a company or you're a person, there's this general global anxiety around now around uncertainty. People feel like uncertainty is ramping up, that things are unpredictable. I mean, things have always been unpredictable, but they feel like the stability is gone. They feel like, some people call this a polycrisis of all the things that are happening. So we say, okay, it's not just about looking far, but like, how are these things combining to make something new today, right? I think that was a big part of what they were experiencing is how to think more holistically, how to think deeper. We always, when we think about the future, we try to narrow it. We try to confine it when we do that as humans, right? But we really say we need to hold an open space for all these things to be true at the same time. And so the first day, which we decided, we're going to do what we do in mapping, which is you're not going to come in with the problems of your city. We're going to do something totally different. So you can learn how to really, really be soaked into futures and these possibilities, which really is about breaking the way we think a lot of times, right? And thinking differently. So what we did is we set the first day of the conference for the foresight in the year 2040. And everybody came as somebody from the year 2040. Some of them were basically the same roles. Sometimes people were like a taxi driver or something. They played a different municipal role, civic role. So we put everybody in different scenarios. Somewhere scenarios, we'll go into all, like how you do scenarios and archetypes, but some that looked a little bit more like one shape, some looked a little bit more maybe like things were falling apart, some that, these different types of things, some types of innovation. So people were in groups and different types of things. So they kind of knew the world that they had shaped in 2040, and then they had to react to things in that world, including like physical artifacts that were around the room from the year 2040. So having someone like a taxi driver is great because you could have a situation, say, where a city planner is also in that group, and they're saying, "Well, we're going to do this with autonomous vehicles," and the taxi driver's like, "Wait, that's my job, that's my livelihood." And so you get these. So by having personas in these workshops, you start to see conflicts of like where you think it's a great idea, you think this is the solution that's going to save everything, it's going to make the town all green, whatever, right? You're like, but what about me? And so then you start to realize that every decision impacts, of course, we know this, but people's lives. But you're sitting across from this person and they're playing the role of the taxi driver. And you're like, you can't just dismiss them and say, well, too bad. And you go, okay, so what do we do? How do we make a solution? Or what would happen? Right. And so you play through these things in a little bit different way when you're allowed to put into this sort of play space, which, let's be fair, most people at a strategic planning and things like that, they do get to be creative, but you don't a lot of times get the permission to just spend a day playing pretend, right? Yet it's so extremely valuable, right? I mean, can you imagine as a kid if you didn't get to pretend at all, and then someone says, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" And you're like, how would you even know what you wanted if you didn't get a chance to play around in it, right? And that's what they need these days for. So that was the first day, and it was just really interesting to see cities break apart the problems that they saw themselves heading towards in 2040, and figuring out then backcasting it to say, what can we do about it now?
You're talking about some very diverse cities, all large cities, but like a lot of diversity in terms of who's there and how they came to be, and all their systems from housing to transportation to economy to culture. You talked about the uncertainty, but I'm curious where else you saw city leaders thinking through this work. Like, what are people talking about? What were the big conversations, and how was this process able to frame that?
So, I mean, we're still analyzing a lot of that work. One of the interesting things about foresight is you don't always know the impact rates. It can be really hard to measure. Right now, we do have some ways of measuring it, but it's like, first of all, how do you measure something that didn't happen? Right? If you avoided something, how do you measure? How do you know? How do you know you avoided it because of that? So that's one. And then the other one is sometimes it takes like 5 years to know that you had any impact, or 10 years. So it's really hard. And what we find is that people start if they start thinking differently, then that's the biggest thing we can do, right away. A lot of stuff that comes out initially isn't necessarily so surprising. So that was kind of my way of getting there. Is that the uncertainties that most of the cities are facing, and this isn't just in this conference, right? This is what I hear from cities all the time and countries, is changing demographics, both from migration and age and other things, different populations, um, which has massive, massive, massive repercussions. That's the thing about uncertainties. If it's an uncertainty and it doesn't really matter, you don't need to know, right? But if it's an uncertainty and it has a lot of impacts, especially across sectors and across, like what we call STEAM, like the social, technological, political stuff. If it has a huge impact on that, then you're of course going to be anxious about it because you feel like you can't plan for anything. So the other one was funding that was directly associated with that, but also associated with many other things. And then the third big one I would say, and again, these aren't surprising, is climate. So we had an event happen in the year 2038 in the scenario of massive sea level rise and some big impacts, right? We didn't go into exactly how it happened because you don't want to get too much in the details a lot of times, because then it's like, well, people start picking it apart or it doesn't hold up over time. So just saying that there was a general global thing and you kind of reference it. What was interesting is that year 2038, that's only 13 years. I don't think anybody raised an objection to that year being implausible, right? I don't know if someone felt that internally, but and a couple people were nodding their heads like, yep, that sounds 2038, So you're looking through the research and you're looking at the data and you're looking at trends, you're looking at signals, and you're not opposed to believing, or it's possible that 2038 is going to have a massive impact on your city, or that time frame. Then that really changes your trajectory of what you're going to be planning for, because you need to be either mitigating it, avoiding it, or doing something, or at least planning to know that if you're not a city that's going to be impacted, let's just say, Well, where do you think all those people from the cities that are
You'll
impacted
be
are going to
impacted by
go?
migration, perhaps, or how we're all connected. So it's interesting. You talked a little earlier. We talked about pace of change
Yeah,
in
yeah.
different sectors and how that is important in kind of understanding some of these, I guess, uncertainties or different futures. And you work with a steep model looking at a number of elements from, social change, environmental, economic, political, and things don't always change at the same pace. I imagine that is really one of the big factors of creating these multiple futures.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't say that pace is so much unknown. It's not necessarily set, but there's definitely a lot of characteristics. Like, in politics in America, at the federal level, you're going to have elections. You're going to have them every 2 years for some, and 4 years for others, and 6 for others. So you have this whole. You know that there's going to be some change, potential change, right, built into the system there that is allowing for change. So you can kind of say what the pace of that, generally speaking, is. There's always outliers of sudden change, but the normal pace of certain changes may accelerate and decelerate over time, but they will kind of have this constant feel to them, generally speaking, until they're completely disrupted. And what we see right now is there's a lot of disruption, which is kind of making it hard. It is harder to gauge the pace of change, but we still can kind of look at it and say, okay, we know that certain things are going to go faster than others. Like regulation and technology is a great one. We know technology just is going to always move faster than regulation and it makes sense because how can you regulate something that doesn't exist? Well, we should be doing that. We should be doing that on things like quantum computing, not that it doesn't exist. We should be doing that on things like general AI, right? We should be having some plans about that, but we don't because that process of regulation is generally a lot slower. That is a great example of how these paces work differently. And we have to know that as futurists, like, okay, if this happens, about how long do we think that this other impact on regulation would happen? And then once it's regulated, how long before people start suing over it, right? And then how long before that becomes this and that, and how long does it have an impact on these other things? How long before it starts? Someone says, "Hey, this now violates my civil rights." So we have to look at those things and kind of understand what is changing and how fast. So that's one of the biggest aspects of speed of change is what we call pace layers. But the other one's also where that change is in relationship to time. So we call that the futures triangle. And that also kind of has to do with the speed and pace of change. You could have something what we call the weight of the past. So there's weight of the past, push of the present, and pull of the future. And weight of the past are things that many times people think of as friction. We can't get things done because of this, but it's also a stabilizing baseline. Sometimes you can only get things done because there's something stable to build upon. Those are changes that happen slowly, are resistant to being changed. And so if you have elements of change within inside of that area, we know they're going to behave, generally speaking, again, unless there's a major disruptor, in a certain way.
Give me an example of that. Like, help me understand that a little more practically.
Well, I mean, I think so. I like to think of it like if you think about a city, right? You think about you're going to have some laws on the books, right? Those laws may be hard to change. Some of them, right? They're there. They're maybe there for a good reason, and there may be a social reason behind them, a values reason, an equity reason. That's going to be pretty hard to change, right? So those things are there. But then you might have another thing in your city where you are in the middle of doing an infrastructure project and it's going to end in a year, right? That has what we call push of the present. It has momentum on it. You're not, generally speaking, you're not just going to hopefully cancel that project in the middle and just like leave the road in disarray and say, well, I guess we're done. No, you're gonna probably see it through. So that has this sort of push of the present. And then pull the future would be like, what if we had a city that didn't have any roads? Like that's aspirational. Or saying, what are we going to do? What if we have a city that's completely flooded? That's still this sort of fear of the future as opposed to pull of the future, right? But but they act very differently because there aren't in our imagination. One's very practical, and one's like we can't imagine a world without it, right? It's like what we're based on. So those three types of areas of change are super critical when you're doing strategic planning. It's not just about major events we try to anticipate. We try to anticipate where the change is happening and how best to influence it or respond to it.
Going back to the conference, 5 years from now in these cities, if this was a successful week, what would that feel like in Johannesburg and Rio? Like, how will that impact how these city leaders are thinking about their futures and their cities?
I mean, at a basic level, I think it's maturing foresight, it's maturing futures thinking. Really, I mean, I don't care if you have an exact foresight methodology for certain things. If you have the basic concepts of critical thinking and futures thinking, the tools are going to come out of it. You're going to invent them yourselves if you don't use the ones that are already out there. That's what we do. So I think it's it being that having those discussions at a real level. Then each city and community is going to have different ways of where that looks like specifically for success. Like for some, like I always say, like you talked about like having like people of the future generations, and well, why not have them on these councils to begin with? And some cities do, but I mean, like seriously have them on the council, like not violating child labor laws or anything, right? But let's get some people in there, before their frontal lobes are all developed. They're going to come up with some interesting ideas, and they're going to tell you what they're experiencing, and be able to listen to them with an open voice and realize, you know what, this isn't your future, it's their future. I think that's super important. So doing things like that, activities like that, I think would be successful. Things that make the cities, more functionally empathetic, right? So they may have a tendency to feel good, but like, well, how do you put that into practice? Like, how do you build success on that? So I think it's just, it's not, some will make it more formal, right? Like we're going to have a Department of Foresight, and then some probably won't. But I think you should have a culture of foresight, because who would argue like, geez, I'd really like to be better informed about what could happen in the future. Like who would say they don't want that? Especially if you're a planner, like that's kind of like that's like magic. Like, why wouldn't you want that?
As we're looking at planning cities on whatever level, whether that's making our annual work plan or a 10, 20-year strategic plan, what are some things we can do to strengthen our own toolbox in terms of thinking about foresight?
Yeah, there's a lot. And when people talk to me like on a personal level how to do it, I think that's the easiest place to start. Sometimes you get a leader that wants to like just like let's figure out how to build a culture around it, and that's a little different. But usually starts at the individual level. There's a couple of simple practices you can do. Basically, we do signal scanning, and that's a real simple process, and it takes not very long to learn how to do it, and to do it with a little bit of methodology, right? Not a lot. But essentially, you're looking for change, and so you learn a little bit about, okay, well, how do I recognize change, and how do I recognize something that's a signal that I would care about and one that I wouldn't care about, right? And so you do this. We do this naturally a little bit. It's like, oh, it's a news story that sounds interesting. Well, why is it interesting? Why do you care about that news story? Is it, what about it is there? And so you take that same concept. You say, well, what about this news story could indicate that there's something different than what I currently anticipated? And you start to think a little further out, and you get to go a little broader, and you're researching sources or just your everyday, and you just record it. You go, oh, this is interesting. It's like this could be something happening and maybe an impact in 5 years. It's around fusion, or it's around infrastructure, and it's about automated vehicles. And you just kind of start to save these, right? You can save them just mentally, but it helps to record them, and there's tools out there to do that. And then you start to see that, wait a minute, after I collect these thoughts and I collect them like digitally, I can start to see some grouping, some patterns, some things that I didn't see before. But really, once you practice this, you will not be able to look at information, news, and other things, and even like Reddit threads, whatever it is, and not start to see shifts of change and possibilities. Right? It's almost like you just get this new sense, kind of like in that old movie They Live, where you put the sunglasses on and then you can see the aliens. Right? It's like once you practice foresight, you can put these glasses on, and then you start to see things, and it's like, I got to respond. It's everywhere. I've got to respond. So that's the number one thing. And then just having a sense of like, you don't need to be right about the future. You don't need to predict. Break that sense, especially in our modern Western globalized world of like, we have to be exactly right. Like, no, it's okay. You don't have to. I mean, living that strictly and precisely doesn't always feel healthy. It creates a lot of anxiety. It creates a lot of tension. And so I think that happens at a community level too, when you try to force these things. And it helps create the polarizations we see in many communities today. And it's like, why does there have to be a black and white? Like, when did we ever get that thought that like that's the only way we can move forward? Is we have to define everything so precisely. And so that's the thing about foresight, is you really want to practice futures thinking. It's not just about what's happening in the future. It's thinking like you're open to things being different than what you thought they were. And then once you start thinking about that, you start thinking, well, maybe that's not the answer. and you start to question things more. And that's really it's a culture of questioning and imagining.
In this world of foresight for you, where do you find hope?
This is a conversation we as futurists talk about all the time. But I think we find hope in the fact that we believe we have agency, right? If we didn't have agency, why would we study the future? It wouldn't really matter. If we knew the whole future but couldn't do anything about it, then what would be the point? So I think the fact that we believe that people have agency and we can change things. Not that it's easy, not that we'll be successful, but we have the possibility, right? I think that's the primary thing that gives hope. I'd say the second thing that gives me hope would be talking to people, right? And working with people across different political spectrums, across different cultures, economic spectrums, whatever, hearing their struggles and hearing their joys and all that stuff. And I think like, well, it's very nuanced. It's not polar. There's a lot of similarities in the things that we care about and the things we worry about, but people are feeling left behind and they feel like they don't have agency. So hearing them and then hearing their dreams, what they'd like to have happen and their hopes, I think gives me hope because it's like, oh, well, maybe we can make that happen. Especially when you get people to find a way that maybe something can happen or might happen differently than what they expected. They at least get a light bulb. That gives me hope because I feel like I've lighted some candle. But real quick, I got this amazing experience years ago at San Diego Comic-Con to ask Ray Bradbury a question. I'm a huge science fiction fan, especially older science fiction as well. And so I asked him, like, your contemporaries. He was really old at the time, but I said, contemporaries growing up and when you're writing, a lot of them write these very dystopian and dark futures and things going wrong with society and technology. But a lot of your stories are filled with hope and inspiration and finding a way through. It says, why is yours so different? And I remember he got that little bit cantankerous that he would get. He said, hope. How can you not have hope? And he's like, the life is just this is the most amazing thing in the world that we have life, and it's just such a beautiful thing. Every instant is a miracle, basically, right? And so, how could you not have hope? And I was taken aback by that a little bit. It's really stuck with me my whole life, and so I think as a futurist, I think about some of his stuff and some of his stories that give me hope, and how change has turned out for the better, even through very, very dire situations. A great story I recommend for everybody to read is the Toynbee Convector short story. And that kind of goes into like that whole idea of how we have agency and hope. So I think I just find it in people, and I find it in the fact that I believe we can make change, and then finding inspiration through sources like that.
I love it. Well, you give me hope. Thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I would love to dig in deeper again sometime, but thank you for jumping in on the Sidewalk Ballet and for the work you're doing and helping us understand the many futures ahead. So appreciate you.
Chip, appreciate you too. Thank you so much.
JT Mudge is an award-winning futurist who's passionate about sustainability, ethics, and ancestral futures. Again, the views expressed by JT in this conversation are his alone. You can find out more about JT and the work he does at jtmudge.com. That link's in the show notes or at sidewalkballet.com. We'll be right back. So tell me your experience of going to the World's Fair.
It was phenomenal. And first of all, your father and I were romantically connected, and he was lucky enough to be in the Air Force and get a job at the World's Fair for just policing it, So I would go up and they would meet me at the door, and I don't know if there was a fee to get in or not, but I know that I got in free. And so he would go and do his work, and I would just go and do the fair, and then we would meet when he had a break, and it was very nice. So the things I remember most were Walt Disney's It's a Small World After All. That was so cute and it was so catchy. We liked seeing the first telephone that you would see the person on the other end of the line. Because at the time at home, some neighborhoods had only one telephone, and operators at the telephone company were still using the whole wire system that you will know in your generation. You'll know it because of Lily Tomlin. So at my grandmother's house, she was the first one on the block to get a telephone. So everybody wanted to use it. and she was very generous with it. But by the time she had teenage grandchildren, she started to kind of pull back and give kind of rules like, okay, you can't be on it for more than 3 minutes. And she got the hourglass from the game that was 3 minutes. And as you probably have figured out by now, I was the granddaughter that got the most phone calls. When I was a teenager, a telephone was still, you picked the phone up to want a dial tone that wasn't really happening yet. It was an operator that was there that's saying, um, "What number, please?" And then you would tell them the number, and then if you could get on, it was fine. But then if you picked it up and somebody else was still on the phone, they could be nasty, I'll tell you. It was really, and they hated to have kids on the phone anyway. Who wouldn't? So that thing now to have a little bitty, 3 by 6-inch telephone in your pocket that you can do Google on and everything and, chase the world is phenomenal to think in this short time. I mean, I might be old to you, but that's a short window of time. I believed I would see it in my life. I believed it was all there for me. I believed to the very heart of it that, yes, this is what I want. This is what I'm going to get.
Listening to my mom talk about the World's Fair, it's not hard to notice how specific that future was. There was a lot to see and do at the fair, and for this teenage girl, the technological advances of the telephone stood out. If you think about it, that makes sense. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was shaped by the moment she was living in. The present is shaped by the past, but it's also true that the future is shaped by the present. It grows out of the moment that imagines it. You can see that clearly in another World's Fair, the 1962 Century 21 Exposition in Seattle. That fair wasn't just a celebration of what might come next. It was a statement about who we were in that moment, what we valued, and where we thought the world was headed. My friends at the Downtown Seattle Association introduced me to Seattle-based historian Feliks Banel. There's a longer version of our conversation at sidewalkballet.com. We talked about the context that the 62 fair was imagined in, and how the fair's future visions were shaped by that moment, and how they went on to shape the city itself. Here's my conversation with Feliks Banel. Welcome to the Sidewalk Ballet. I'm excited to have you on the podcast to talk about the future back in the past.
It's my pleasure. It feels like we're back in the past and the future at the same time having this conversation. My name is Feliks Banel. I've lived in Seattle my whole life, other than a couple of years on the East Coast when I was in my early 20s. My parents immigrated from Europe and came here in the 50s, and I am a historian and media person. I was a deputy director at the big history museum here in town for about 7 years. Worked at a commercial radio station for about a decade. I've done freelance stuff for a bunch of other radio stations and TV and everything. So my interest is in history and in connecting, because when I worked at the museum, it was always frustrating how few people could come through the door. That was our audience right there. And taking history and doing it via media, whether it's podcast or radio or TV. And the infinite possibility. Of course, you can be ignored by an infinite audience as well, but the potential of a much larger audience is so great for history and storytelling, and particularly audio. I don't think there's any better combinations of disciplines and media.
How did you come to that? Where did your interest in history spur? Have you always had that since you were young, or was there something that introduced you to the world of history?
Had older parents. I'm the youngest of 9 kids. My dad, I think, was 45 when I was born. My mom was 40. And they both survived World War II. My dad was a 16-year-old in Poland when the Nazis invaded. My mom was, I think, 11 when World War II started, where she lived in London, and she, lived through all the Blitz and everything. And so we always talked about history, because it was always, both my parents had been affected so deeply and personally by world history that we paid attention. We watched, 60 Minutes and watched the news and read the newspapers and always talked. It was always very present. It wasn't like a nostalgic thing. It was sort of it was survival. Like, I think my dad listened to the radio all the time because he was convinced, the Soviets were going to attack at some point. So it's been a lifelong pursuit for me to understand what my parents experienced. I just feel like that World War II history is so relevant today as we're seeing it being dismantled, all the benefits of that victory. And I feel like that story, it's so critical that we don't lose sight of that story, from, even though it's 80 years ago, and even though it's, most of the people who took part or witnessed it are gone. It's almost more important than the founding fathers' story, that story of what the U.S. did in World War II with our allies and what we did to create a new world that's crumbling before our eyes right now. So anyway, that's the short version of why I like history so much.
Seattle is very connected to World War II. And you mentioned your dad worked for Boeing. So draw me a little bit of a line to how Seattle plays a role, both in the history of and in the context of World War II, and I guess even pre and post-war America.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Boeing company was headquartered here from, I think, 1916 until 2002 when they uprooted the headquarters. But the aircraft that they developed here in the 1930s and 1940s that were used by the Allies, huge role in the B-17, critical to victory in Europe, B-29, critical to victory in the Pacific, delivering the atomic bomb and everything. But Boeing, the transformation of this area, the workforce that Boeing put together, beginning in the run-up to World War II in the late 1930s and all throughout World War II, completely transformed Seattle. The population grew hugely during World War II, people moving from other parts of the country for really, good-paying defense jobs. It's the first time that we really had housing shortages, that we kind of thing we're facing now as a modern 21st century city. So the other thing that Boeing did was it trained a really very skilled workforce, kind of a middle class or blue-collar workforce, paid very well, that after World War II, when the dawn of civil aviation, like jet travel and everything comes a few years later, a lot of well-paid people working manufacturing jobs, buying second homes, buying boats. It was a really high quality of life here and a very affordable place to live all throughout most of the 20th century. It really doesn't start to really turn into this kind of overpriced, kind of big city, big world city with world city problems until the 1990s or early 2000s. So Boeing really did transform the culture. And they used to say, if Boeing sneezes, Seattle catches cold. Of course, it's much more diversified now when Microsoft comes along in the 80s and all the other technology that's followed since then. And Boeing, diversifying and moving their manufacturing to other parts of the country. It's a very different community than it was. But from, say, World War II up into the 1980s, Seattle and Boeing were, you couldn't, it was one and the same. They were, the different sides of the same coin.
So in the middle of that, Seattle decides to host a little event in 1962. And what was that moment in America?
Yeah, the 50s in Seattle that's kind of when the city that we know nowadays really is born, because Boeing leads the way with the development of a jetliner, the 707, which if you look at most jetliners nowadays, you can't tell them apart from a 707. Boeing kind of perfected the design. So Seattle's booming in the 1950s with the dawn of jet aviation. So for 1959, it's 50 years past when Seattle had its first World's Fair, one of these sort of 19th century style, though it was in 1909, Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. Portland had one like that. San Francisco, San Diego, every kind of relatively big city had a World's Fair like that in the 19th century, early 20th century. And the AYP in Seattle was a big deal. I mean, they used it as a little bit of a foreshadow to what they did with the World's Fair in '62, which we'll talk about. They used the money to build out the fairgrounds for the 1909 fair on the very tiny University of Washington campus. And they built all these streets and buildings and things that once that fair was over, they reused them as classrooms and housing. I mean, really smart. Again, they did echo the same thing a few years later, 50 years later in 1962. So that idea grew to have that 1959 fair, and it got delayed. And the big thing that really shifted everything was Sputnik. October 4th, 1957. Also the same day that Leave It to Beaver premieres on ABC. Coincidentally. So Sputnik is a Soviet satellite that's circling around the Earth, and everyone's it's circling overhead of the United States. Everyone's paranoid. The Soviets are winning the space race. So the federal government is looking for opportunities to invest in technology and promoting American technology. And our congressional delegation figures out there's ways to get federal money to give a new boost, shot in the arm for this little tiny fair that's kind of starting to come together, starting to coalesce. And they get $12 million in 1957, which is a huge amount of money then. And I mean, enormous amount of money then. Still, $12 million still sounds pretty big to me now. And that lets them build a United States Science Pavilion. And the fair, which had been sort of looking for a theme, I mean, it was still going to be this 50th anniversary thing for this Alaska Yukon Pacific Fair, very backward-looking fair, like 50 years. All of a sudden kind of morphs into this very futuristic fair about science in the future, which fits in perfectly with Boeing, because you could argue that Boeing is the most high-tech company in America in the late 1950s in terms of what they're doing with jet travel and military aviation and the B-52 and all these missiles and everything that were, the forefront of high technology in those days. And so That theme coalesces around the fair. It gets delayed a little bit because these things always take time, and it doesn't happen until 1962. And the Space Needle kind of fits in with that as well, the symbol of the fair that became the symbol of Seattle. Animators who created the Jetsons television series a few years later, there's documented proof that they were inspired by the look and feel of the Space Needle to create all those goofy kind of futuristic Jetsons homes in the Jetson cartoon series. And so the fair is all about the future. It's all about Century 21. That's the theme. And brilliantly, I mean, it's if you kind of look behind the curtain, it's almost like a giant version of those old West buildings where there's a big tall storefront that's rectilinear, but if you look behind it, there's a little peaked roof, kind of, so it's sort of like a fake storefront. They took a number of old buildings that dated to the 20s or the 40s in some cases and gussied them up, put new facades on them, but like 21st century looking modern, futuristic, mid-century modern facades on these old, ornate, classical buildings. And not exactly on the cheap, but in a very value-focused way, created this 72-acre fairgrounds in a place that was already kind of a civic destination that ended up being a perfect spot to hold the fair because it was just far enough away from downtown where the real estate was relatively cheap, but it was close enough in where it felt like you were in Seattle. You weren't going to some, like Flushing Meadows kind of thing, like with the New York Fair in the 1960s. The fair really transformed the city. It created this sense of civic can-do. I mean, it made money. It was profitable. 10 million people came through the turnstiles at a time when Seattle had about 500,000 people in their population. Ran for 6 months, from May to October of 1962. And it ends up being sort of almost like a last chapter before the really scary part of the Cold War. I mean, literally to the day. President Kennedy is there remotely on April 21st when the fair starts off. And in a nod to the past, he's at, I think, the Kennedy Florida White House, like Florida compound, and he's got the old gold-encrusted telegraph key that President Taft used to start the 1909 fair off. When they press the button, the fair would be officially started. So Kennedy does that by telephone, addresses the public, just audio-wise. And then 6 months later, he's supposed to come back. He's supposed to be here for the closing ceremonies on Sunday, October 21st. Everybody's excited, and then they get word on maybe the Thursday or Friday that, President has a cold. He's not going to be coming west. He's not going to go to Chicago. He's going to stay in D.C. and get over this illness that he has. And then the fair ends on October 21st, and the next day, Monday, October 22nd, it's like the official start of the Cuban Missile Crisis because Kennedy doesn't have a cold. He's just staying home to deal with the fact that American spy planes have detected Soviet missile bases being built in Cuba, and he goes on TV that night, less than 24 hours after the World's Fair has ended. Kennedy gets on TV and says, we've detected Soviet missile bases. And as we know, of course, a nuclear war didn't happen, but it was a pretty scary couple weeks there where it seemed like we were on the precipice. So it was a very sobering way for that 6-month celebration of the future to get kind of a cold slap in the face with, the realities of human nature. It's like it always kind of devolves to war. So, and then the 62 World's Fair was no exception.
So that, in some ways, I mean, you kind of set that up in that was the World's Fair in Seattle was sort of the end of the pre-Cold War, even though we were in the space race, which was kind of connected to the Cold War and kind of the hubris that went around that. And the fair was informed a lot by that future. And you talk about the theme being future and science. And at that time, I think a big part of science and future was space in the space race. How much of the fair was reflective of what people were already thinking about, and how much was leading where we might be going?
I think it's it's a dialogue. I mean, the space program in the United States. I think Alan Shepard goes into space in May of '61, and the media, was all over that, and that was a big part of the conversation going on in this country about what the future was going to be about. And so by the late 1950s. The Soviets, our great World War II allies, the Soviets aren't our allies anymore. We've been in this, Cold War for 10 or 15 years at this point. The reality of being able to be destroyed by a missile, I think that's really clear in 1962 because we've been watching on TV, Alan Shepard, John Glenn. And John Glenn comes to the fair. They have his capsule there on display. Big part of the interior display of the United States Science Pavilion is related to NASA and the space program. And astronauts come and are, celebrated for being there at the fair. So it's a big part of it. in terms of where it comes from and what people were expecting, I do think it is a dialogue. It'd be hard pressed in 1962 to not be aware of all the stuff going on in the space race and the U.S. promoting those, the Mercury 7, those celebrity astronauts that everybody knows, their household names. Kids could name, Gus Grissom and John Glenn and Alan Shepard and all, the different capsule names. Freedom 7, the Mercury 7 astronauts. There's an effort to compete with the Soviet Union with our own space program, and so that fits right into 1962. The other consumer technology stuff, so much great technology emerges from World War II in terms of improvements to things like automobiles and civilian aviation. And so we're already, even in the 1950s, we're already living in an age that feels kind of futuristic. And that whole mid-century modern architecture is accentuating and emphasizing this sort of sleek modern materials. There's melamine bowls and aluminum, stamped aluminum, stuff that wasn't really common before World War II. We're already saturated in that kind of material culture in the 1950s. So with capitalism, it's all about what the next new thing is, and that's why touch-tone phones make their debut at the Seattle World's Fair. It's you don't have to turn that big rotary dial anymore. But also a big part of the fair, at its heart, it's still a carnival. There's carnival rides, and the critics of the fair, because there were critics here. Not everyone was on board having a fair in Seattle. The neighborhoods around those existing civic structures were wiped out, kind of, lower income neighborhoods that couldn't complain about anything, didn't really have the ability to put a stop to that land being demolished through eminent domain. And there were people who were just, every city always has people who just make fun of stuff, and they call it the Carnival on Mercer Street, which is where the main street that goes along the north end of the fairgrounds. But it overcame all that, and it made money, and you still, even here more than 60 years later, it's hard to look at anything that's happened since then and not see some kind of connection to the fair. So that the futuristic part for me, the most futuristic looking part of the fair, it's not the Space Needle, which is cool. It's not touch-tone phones. It's not the video calls. It's this notion of we're going to have this 6-month carnival, but then when it's over, we're going to have this incredible civic campus that's going to fit and serve this growing community that, it's still heart of the baby boom, a couple of years away from baby boom switching into Gen X. And it's so far-sighted because while parts of the fairgrounds, the Seattle Center, they call it now, still look kind of the same, like the Science Pavilion is now the Science Center, and the Space Needle, still there, of course. And the monorail, the goofy 1 mile long transportation device from downtown, the core pieces are still there, but many other places have been torn down and rebuilt, or the Washington State Pavilion, which is where they had the Bubbleator and the World of Tomorrow, where you went up this big plexiglass sphere and looked down through a domed city. That got remodeled and became a venue for our first major league team, the Seattle Supersonics, the base basketball team. But that was recently completely redone as a giant concert venue. They kept the original roof line, dug down deeper, and you go inside, and it's this incredible new facility for our new NHL team, and if we get an NBA team that comes back. So the core pieces are still there, but it's adapted and evolved, and that's really futuristic. If you can build something that's still standing 60 years later that can be renovated and remodeled in a way that makes it feel like it's brand new, yet retains this through line to the past, I don't know of any other way to think about the future in a way that's smart for a big city, because you can't just mow stuff down and build new stuff all the time. There has to be some sort of through line. In all the great cities have a through line, and Seattle doesn't necessarily have that in many other parts of the city, but they do at Seattle Center. I think that's crazy.
How do people in Seattle every day, either residents or visitors, how do they engage with the various elements of the fair that have remained?
The monorail is kind of a curious one because they have invested a lot of money in it recently, and it's part of the transportation strategy for the NHL team, the Kraken, which has only been playing for about 4 years now. And so, it's because the monorail still connects the heart of downtown Seattle, what they call Westlake Center, Westlake Park, with Seattle Center. And it's the easiest way to get back and forth between those two spaces. And it feels kind of clunky. It's a mile-long route. It's over in a minute. It goes 60 miles an hour. And I've had guests from out of town who get on, and we get at the downtown station and we go north. The ride's over in about 90 seconds. And they look around that's it? Because it's the end of the line, which is, but it does its job, oddly enough, even though it feels kind of antiquated. The other spaces, Some of the theaters that were built for the fair or remodeled for the fair are on the edge of the campus. And I would bet there's people who come to see the ballet or come to see theatrical performances who don't even think about they're going to Seattle Center. They're just like, they're going to the theater that's off Mercer Street, especially if they've moved here in the last 20 or 30 years. But like Climate Pledge Arena, that's what they now call the Seattle Center Coliseum, and what was originally the Washington State Pavilion, where that Bubbleator and World of Tomorrow exhibit was. That's the best example of a element of the fair that the shape is still there. The roof, this distinctive roof line with these big concrete trusses. You know, the Beatles played there in 1964. The Supersonics played there starting in the late 60s. It was, you know, hundreds of concerts, hundreds of important events have been held there where people have gathered for different reasons. And that's, you know, the interior is totally different, totally gutted and rebuilt. But when you come walking up to it, it still feels to me like I felt going to see like Disney on Ice there, probably like 1972 when I was a little kid. The other space is this big fountain that was designed, the International Fountain. They've changed the guts and how the water sprays out of it, and they kind of rebuilt the mechanical parts of it. But the gathering space is still there, and there's photographs going back at least to the 1970s where that place was used for different impromptu public gatherings and ways of sort of public memorials. I was 12 years old, I think. When John Lennon died, they had a John Lennon memorial there. When Kurt Cobain died, I was there for that as well. After 9/11, there was big public gatherings. It's kind of this unique public space because Seattle doesn't have like a central park. If you go to downtown Seattle, other than the waterfront, there isn't sort of a big green area where you'd naturally gather near downtown. So Seattle Center has sort of functioned as this gathering space. I don't know. I'd love to be able to talk to some of those World's Fair guys, you know, from 65 years ago. I don't think any of them imagined how successful the Seattle Center part, the after fair part would be. I think they had a pretty good idea that it would do its job. But the fact that it's been evolved over time and continued to reinvent itself and continued to be relevant for sports and arts and public gatherings and science and, you know, tourism with the Space Needle, I think is still the most visited attraction in the state. It's mind-blowing.
If you were in charge of the next World's Fair coming to Seattle, would you put it in the same place, or would you develop a new neighborhood and create a new center?
No, I think you'd have to have it in the same place, but that would run the risk of it feeling very sentimental. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think we need to have a World's Fair anymore. I think Seattle, you know, no thank you. I think we've World's Fairs, I believe, are for cities that are sort of trying to prove something or trying to invite people to show them something that they might not have seen before. And maybe this is true now of every city, the way media has changed and the way access to information and images has changed. It's almost like the idealism behind a fair like Seattle in 62, or even the one that I most recently went to was Vancouver in 1986. That sense that, you know, the world wasn't as connected as it could be. And then if we knew each other and had face-to-face relationships with each other, the world would be a better and a safer place. If things are all cyclical, I could see 10, 20 years down the line, some new age where we are, in fact, reconnecting with the world and inviting our allies and our friends and sharing in this futuristic look, because there's still the intractable problems that were trying to be addressed in World's Fairs in 50, 60 years ago. We still have problems with housing and hunger and transportation and the environment.
You know, one of the things that I think is really important about the work you are doing as a historian and a communicator is, you know, when you look at societies that have collapsed or empires that have fallen, a big thread you can point to is collective amnesia. And I think to the degree that we can continue to understand our past and understand our history, that informs how we move into the future in so many ways. And I think we are really susceptible to forgetting what happened last week, let alone last century, and how important that is for us in designing and, as you mentioned, strengthening our communities and strengthening our cities. So I think continuing to tell the story of what happened is important for creating the story about what will happen.
If we aren't talking about our values all the time, and again, not to be not boorish history lectures like Putin, but just a way to kind of illuminate everything we do with, like, how does this align with our values? And is what we're doing, you know, is it what's it about? Why are we doing this? And how does this relate to the past? Very few people have patience for that. The beat I did for 10 years at this local commercial radio station, I was a reporter focused on history, but I got to be subjective. And I always said, like, I cover local history like I'm a sports reporter covering the home team, and I want history to win.
What does Seattle 1962 in the World's Fair tell us? What do we learn about cities today, about how to build cities, how to build community, how to build the future? What do we learn from that moment?
I think it's partly about timing, that Sputnik launch and that money being available to kind of give it a shot in the arm. But specifically in Seattle, what it meant was that if there was collective agreement about what they wanted to accomplish, which there was, they could pull off something that was nobody thought they could do, and it would train this sort of phalanx of civic engineers, guys who then would go on to do stuff to tackle some of these other problems, whether it was pollution or there's this thing called forward thrust that came out in 1965. A bunch of at its time, the biggest ballot measure in terms of total dollars, tax dollars raised anywhere in the States to fund a whole bunch of specific things like acquiring public land, building swimming pools, building public parks. But it gave a boost to what was possible. I think that gave Seattle the confidence that emerges decade after decade with the film community, with the literary community, with the music in the 1990s and everything. It kind of gave us a confidence that we wouldn't have to be a version of New York. And we're our own thing. We kind of found our own way to do it because we're thousands of miles away from the East Coast. We're just, we don't have all the resources that other cities have, but we're going to do it on our own and pull it off. And that's true in the 1850s, true in the 1960s. Don't know if it's true now. I mean, it's different now. It's a different world. The challenges are different. And I think when I worked at the Chamber of Commerce in the 1990s, it was all about, we're going to be this world-class city. We have Microsoft here, Nintendo. We're going to be huge. Seattle's going to be very popular. And it all came true. But some of the stuff along the way, like housing and transportation, didn't quite keep up. And now we're struggling with that gap between this big world-class city with world-class ambitions and huge technology companies here, but we don't quite have the back end to support all that stuff in a way that makes it possible to live here in a way that, people of all incomes can survive. We have big city, world city problems now, but I'm confident we can tackle them because we have this history we can look. Our current mayor always talks about Space Needle ideas and this notion of like one Seattle. And they use the Space Needle as a metaphor for thinking big. I haven't seen it really kind of pay off yet. And I don't know if it's clear what a big Space Needle idea is, but I think the potential is there to use the past, not as something to club over the head with about like we should be doing this, but as inspiration because, the future is unwritten as we sit here right now. But as long as we carry through those values that I was talking about, there's a through line, which is good for everybody.
I love it. Feliks, thank you so much for talking to me. I really appreciate it. And we'll look for the big Space Needle ideas or the grunge ideas or whatever comes out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Chip. Bye-bye.
Feliks Banel is an Emmy-winning and Edward R. Murrow Award-winning broadcaster and former deputy director of Seattle's Museum of History and Industry. Our full conversation's available at sidewalkballet.com. There's some great links, including his podcast, Cascade of History, in the show notes. Listening back to these conversations, what stays with me isn't whether anyone got the future right. It's how seriously they took the act of imagining it. For my mom, the future was something you could step into, something that made the world feel larger than the classroom she left behind. For the people who built the World's Fair, imagining the future was a way to organize effort, to signal values, to say this is the direction we're willing to move. And for futurists like JT, the work isn't prediction. It's creating space to think beyond the limits of the present. The present is shaped by the past, and the future is shaped by the moment that imagines it. When you're in a space race, the future tends to point upward. So the question as we head into 2026, what kind of future are we pointing towards now? Sidewalk Ballet is presented by Big Creative Consulting, strengthening community through culture and place. Learn more at bigcreativeconsulting.com. Also by This Must Be the Place, a bi-monthly newsletter connecting placemaking professionals to opportunities. Learn more at thismustbe.org. Contributors include Abra Allen and myself, engineering and editing by Ryan Musanse. Our theme music was composed by the Peacoat Project. If this conversation resonated, please do share it with someone who's doing the work of keeping their community whole, and join the conversation on our Discord server, also linked at sidewalkballet.com. I'm Chip. Thanks so much for joining us on this block of the Sidewalk Ballet. I'll see you downtown.
That's what I loved about the World's Fair. It made it seem like it was all like, turn the page, tomorrow, here it is.